In September 2024, archival specialist Jennifer Walsh received a collection of photographs from the demolished Riverside Hospital in Albany, New York. The century-old medical facility had served the community since 1895 before finally closing, due to budget constraints and modern healthcare consolidation. Among the institutional records and medical equipment being disposed of, maintenance workers had discovered a forgotten archive containing patient files, administrative documents, and personal photographs dating back to the hospital's earliest years. Walsh specialized in preserving historical medical documents and had been contracted to identify materials of historical significance before the building's complete demolition. Most items were routine medical records and administrative paperwork, but she was particularly interested in photographs that might document early 20th century medical practices or hospital life. One photograph from 1904 immediately caught her attention due to its unusual preservation and professional quality. The formal family portrait showed what appeared to be a prosperous middle-class family of four: a distinguished man in his 40s, wearing a dark suit and high collar, typical of the Edwardian era, a woman of similar age in an elegant dark dress with intricate beadwork, and two children, a boy of about 10 and a girl of perhaps 7, dressed in their finest clothes. The photograph had been taken in a professional studio, evidenced by the painted backdrop depicting a pastoral scene and the careful arrangement of furniture that suggested this was a family celebrating some significant milestone. Written in careful script on the back were the words, "The Morrison Family, March 1904, Albany Studio." What appeared to be a typical documentation of American family prosperity during the Progressive Era would soon reveal evidence of one of the most sophisticated medical deceptions in early 20th century healthcare, a discovery that would expose the dark underbelly of experimental medicine and patient exploitation during an era of limited medical regulation. Using professional magnification equipment, Walsh examined every detail of the 1904 Morrison family portrait with growing confusion and alarm. The photograph showed exceptional technical quality for its era, indicating the work of Albany's premier portrait studio serving the city's most affluent families. The family's positioning followed standard conventions of formal Edwardian photography, the father standing proudly behind his seated wife, with the children arranged to demonstrate family hierarchy and prosperity. Everyone wore expensive clothing that indicated significant wealth, and their expressions projected the confidence and respectability expected of successful American families during the Progressive Era. However, Walsh noticed something deeply disturbing about the father's positioning and anatomy that defied logical explanation. While Mr. Morrison stood in a typical formal pose, with one hand resting on his wife's shoulder in a gesture of protection and authority, his other hand appeared to be positioned at his side in a relaxed manner. The problem was anatomical. The hand resting on his wife's shoulder and the hand at his side showed distinctly different skin tones, sizes, and even apparent ages. The hand on Mrs. Morrison's shoulder appeared younger, with smoother skin and different proportions than what should have been expected from a man in his 40s. More troubling, the positioning of this hand seemed to violate normal human joint mechanics. The angle and reach suggested an impossible extension of the arm dot. Most disturbing was the family's reaction to this anatomical impossibility. While the children appeared relaxed and natural, both Mr. and Mrs. Morrison showed subtle signs of tension in their facial expressions. Mrs. Morrison's smile appeared forced, and there was a tightness around her eyes that suggested discomfort or distress, despite the formal nature of the portrait session. Walsh realized she was looking at evidence of something far more sinister than a simple photographic error or optical illusion. The hand resting on Mrs. Morrison's shoulder belonged to someone else entirely. Walsh contacted Dr. Robert Blackwood, a medical historian at Albany Medical College who specialized in early 20th century surgical practices and medical ethics. Dr. Blackwood had extensive experience researching historical medical procedures and had documented several cases of experimental surgery during the era when medical regulation was minimal and patient consent was poorly understood. Dr. Blackwood's examination of the 1904 photograph revealed details that immediately alarmed him as both a historian and a medical professional. The anatomical impossibility of Mr. Morrison's hand positioning suggested sophisticated surgical intervention that would have been at the cutting edge of medical technology for that period. What you're showing me appears to be evidence of early limb transplantation or prosthetic attachment, Dr. Blackwood observed, studying the hand through high-powered magnification. The positioning, skin tone differences, and apparent joint mechanics all suggest this man's natural arm and hand had been replaced with tissue from another source. The 1904 timeframe was significant because it coincided with pioneering experiments in surgical transplantation that were being conducted at major medical institutions across the United States. These procedures were typically performed without adequate patient consent and often involved patients from vulnerable populations who had limited ability to refuse experimental treatment. Dr. Blackwood noted that the family's obvious wealth and social status made them unlikely candidates for experimental surgery unless Mr. Morrison had suffered some form of traumatic injury that required radical medical intervention. However, the careful positioning in the photograph suggested the family was trying to conceal rather than celebrate any medical treatment. The fact that they're posing for a formal family portrait while attempting to hide evidence of major surgery suggests this procedure was either unsuccessful, unauthorized, or deeply shameful in some way. Dr. Blackwood concluded he recommended expanding the investigation to include medical records from Albany's hospitals during 1903 to 1904, focusing on experimental surgical procedures and any documentation of unusual cases involving limb replacement or transplantation. Dr. Blackwood's investigation into Albany's medical facilities during the early 1900s revealed that Riverside Hospital, where the photograph had been discovered, had been a pioneering institution in experimental surgery and medical research. The hospital had attracted ambitious physicians who were willing to attempt procedures that were considered too risky or controversial for more established medical institutions. Hospital administrative records from 1903 to 1904, preserved in remarkable detail, documented several experimental surgical programs that had been conducted with minimal oversight or patient protection. These programs had been funded by wealthy benefactors who were interested in advancing medical science, but were unconcerned with ethical considerations or patient welfare. The breakthrough came when Dr. Blackwood discovered the personal records of Dr. Edmund Hartley, Riverside Hospital's chief surgeon from 1900 to 1906. Dr. Hartley had maintained detailed surgical logs that documented experimental procedures he had performed, including several attempts at what he termed reconstructive limb replacement therapy. Dr. Hartley's records from February 1904, just weeks before the Morrison family photograph, contained an entry that made Dr. Blackwood's investigation take a dramatic turn. Patient M, adult male, age 42, industrial accident resulting in complete loss of right arm, experimental reattachment using deceased donor tissue, procedure completed successfully, patient recovering well, family expressing gratitude for restoration of normal appearance. The entry's timing, patient demographics, and procedure description aligned perfectly with the evidence visible in the Morrison family photograph. Dr. Blackwood realized that Mr. Morrison had undergone what was essentially the first documented limb transplantation in American medical history. However, additional entries in Dr. Hartley's records revealed that the successful procedure had not remained successful. Follow-up notes from March and April 1904 documented complications, tissue rejection, infection, and psychological trauma. As the transplanted limb began to fail and the patient realized he was carrying a dead person's arm, Dr. Blackwood's research revealed that Dr. Hartley's limb transplantation experiments were part of a broader program of experimental surgery being conducted at Riverside Hospital with funding from several wealthy Albany families who viewed themselves as patrons of medical progress. The program had been inspired by European experiments in surgical reconstruction and had been designed to develop treatments for industrial accidents that were becoming increasingly common as Albany's manufacturing sector expanded during the early 1900s. The city's textile mills, steel foundries, and machinery factories regularly produced workers with severe injuries that challenged the limits of contemporary medical treatment. Hospital records showed that Dr. Hartley had attempted at least 12 limb transplantation procedures between 1902 and 1905, using tissue harvested from recently deceased patients whose bodies had been donated to the hospital for medical research. The procedures were presented to patients as cutting-edge treatments that would restore normal appearance and function to severely injured limbs. However, Dr. Blackwood discovered that Dr. Hartley's records contained significant gaps and inconsistencies that suggested the program had encountered serious problems that were being concealed from hospital administrators and the general public. Confidential report dated May 1904, written by the hospital's medical director, expressed concerns about Dr. Hartley's experimental procedures. Recent complications in reconstructive surgery program require immediate review. Several patients experiencing significant difficulties. Families expressing concerns about outcomes and requesting alternative treatments. The report indicated that the limb transplantation procedures were failing as patients' immune systems rejected the foreign tissue, causing infections, tissue death, and psychological trauma, as patients struggled to cope with carrying deceased persons' body parts. Most disturbing was evidence that Dr. Hartley had continued performing these procedures despite knowledge that they were causing more harm than benefit to patients, apparently motivated more by scientific curiosity than by patient welfare. Dr. Blackwood expanded his research to include Albany's city directories, business records, and newspaper archives to learn more about the Morrison family and the circumstances that had led to Mr. Morrison's experimental surgery. The Morrison family had been prominent in Albany's business community, with William Morrison operating a successful machinery manufacturing company that supplied equipment to textile mills throughout the Northeast. His business had prospered during the early 1900s as industrial expansion created demand for specialized manufacturing equipment. However, Albany's industrial accident records from late 1903 documented a severe workplace incident at Morrison's factory. The Albany Evening Journal had reported on December 15, 1903, that Mr. William Morrison, prominent manufacturer, was severely injured when machinery malfunction resulted in complete loss of right arm. Mr. Morrison was transported to Riverside Hospital for treatment. The newspaper account had described the accident as particularly tragic because Morrison was known as a careful and safety-conscious business owner who had implemented worker protection measures that exceeded industry standards. His personal injury in his own factory had been seen as a cruel irony by the Albany business community. Dr. Blackwood discovered that Morrison's family had initially been grateful for Dr. Hartley's offer to attempt experimental limb replacement surgery. Letters preserved in the hospital archives showed that Mrs. Morrison had written to Dr. Hartley expressing profound gratitude for your willingness to attempt this miraculous procedure that offers hope for my husband's complete recovery. However, subsequent correspondence revealed growing concerns as the transplanted limb began to fail. A letter from March 1904 showed Mrs. Morrison's desperation. The arm you attached has begun to change color and emit unpleasant odors. My husband experiences constant pain and has developed severe fevers. We request immediate medical attention. The timing of these medical complications coincided exactly with the March 1904 family portrait, suggesting the photograph had been taken during the brief period when the transplanted arm appeared functional, but before the family understood the procedure's ultimate failure. Dr. Blackwood's investigation revealed that the Morrison family's experience was part of a systematic pattern of experimental medical procedures that were being conducted without adequate patient consent or follow-up care. Hospital records showed that Dr. Hartley's limb transplantation program had been quietly terminated in summer 1904 after multiple patient complications and complaints from affected families. A confidential hospital board meeting transcript from July 1904 documented the decision to end the experimental program. Dr. Hartley's reconstructive surgery experiments have produced unacceptable patient outcomes and have generated complaints that threaten the hospital's reputation. All experimental limb replacement procedures will cease immediately. However, the board's primary concern appeared to be protecting the hospital's reputation rather than addressing the harm that had been caused to patients and families. The meeting transcript showed that board members were more worried about potential lawsuits and negative publicity than about the medical ethics violations that had occurred. Dr. Blackwood discovered that affected families, including the Morrisons, had been quietly provided with conventional medical treatment to address complications from the failed experimental procedures, but they had been pressured to avoid discussing their experiences publicly. A confidential agreement between Riverside Hospital and the Morrison family, dated August 1904, provided free medical care for William Morrison's ongoing complications in exchange for the family's promise to refrain from public discussion of experimental treatments received at this institution. The agreement revealed that Morrison had ultimately required amputation of the transplanted limb, which had become severely infected and necrotic as his immune system rejected the foreign tissue. The removal of the dead tissue had left him in worse condition than he had been immediately after his original industrial accident. Medical records showed that Morrison had spent the remainder of 1904 recovering from infections and complications related to the failed transplant procedure. He had eventually been fitted with a prosthetic device, but his health had been permanently compromised by the experimental surgery. Dr. Blackwood's research expanded to examine whether Riverside Hospital's experimental limb transplantation program was part of a broader pattern of unethical medical experimentation occurring at American hospitals during the early 1900s. Medical literature from the 1900 to 1910 period documented numerous experimental surgical procedures being attempted at hospitals throughout the United States, often with minimal oversight and inadequate patient protection. The Progressive era's emphasis on scientific advancement and medical progress had created an environment where ambitious physicians felt justified in attempting dangerous experimental procedures. Dr. Blackwood discovered that several major medical institutions had been conducting similar limb transplantation experiments during this period, with uniformly poor outcomes. The lack of understanding about immune system rejection, inadequate surgical techniques, and absence of effective infection control had made these procedures essentially experimental torture rather than legitimate medical treatment. Hospital records from Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago documented similar experimental programs that had been quietly terminated after patient deaths and complications. In each case, the institutions had attempted to conceal the failures and had provided minimal support to affected patients and families. The pattern revealed a systematic failure of medical ethics and patient protection that extended far beyond a single hospital or single physician. The medical profession during this period had prioritized scientific experimentation over patient welfare, with vulnerable individuals bearing the costs of medical advancement. Dr. Blackwood realized that the Morrison family photograph represented rare visual evidence of these unethical medical experiments. Most evidence of failed experimental procedures had been deliberately destroyed or concealed, making it difficult for medical historians to document the full scope of patient exploitation during this period. Federal regulation of medical experimentation was virtually non-existent during the early 1900s, allowing individual physicians and hospitals to conduct dangerous experimental procedures without oversight or accountability to external authorities. Determined to trace the Morrison family's story beyond the disturbing 1904 photograph, Dr. Blackwood expanded his research to include vital records, business documents, and legal proceedings that would reveal the long-term consequences of William Morrison's experimental surgery. Albany, business records showed that Morrison's manufacturing company had struggled following his industrial accident and failed medical treatment. Unable to manage the physical demands of running a machinery manufacturing operation, Morrison had been forced to sell his business in late 1904 at a significant financial loss. The family's financial difficulties had been compounded by medical expenses related to Morrison's ongoing complications from the failed limb transplant procedure. Hospital bills and physician fees had consumed most of the family's savings, forcing them to relocate from their comfortable home to more modest accommodations. Morrison's health had continued to deteriorate throughout 1905 and 1906. Medical records showed repeated hospitalizations for infections, psychological distress, and complications related to his prosthetic device. The experimental surgery had left him with chronic pain and limited mobility that prevented him from returning to any form of productive employment. Most tragically, Dr. Blackwood discovered that William Morrison had died in January 1907, less than 3 years after his experimental surgery. His death certificate listed the cause as complications from surgical infection, but Dr. Blackwood's research suggested that Morrison had essentially died from the long-term consequences of Dr. Hartley's failed experimental procedure. The Morrison family had attempted to pursue legal action against Riverside Hospital and Dr. Hartley, but their case had been dismissed when hospital administrators denied any wrongdoing and claimed that Morrison had provided informed consent for the experimental procedure. Court records from 1906 showed that the hospital's legal defense had been based on arguments that Morrison had been desperate for treatment and had willingly accepted the risks of experimental surgery. The family's signed confidentiality agreement had been used to prevent them from presenting evidence about the true circumstances of the failed procedure. In October 2025, Dr. Blackwood prepared to publish his findings as part of a comprehensive study documenting unethical medical experimentation. During the early 20th century, his research provided crucial evidence for understanding how patients had been exploited by ambitious physicians who prioritized scientific advancement over patient welfare. Dr. Blackwood collaborated with Albany Medical College and the New York State Museum to create an exhibition honoring the memory of William Morrison and other victims of experimental medical procedures during the Progressive Era. The exhibition used the 1904 family photograph as a centerpiece for discussions about medical ethics, informed consent, and the historical development of patient protection regulations. The photograph itself became a powerful symbol of how medical progress had often come at the expense of vulnerable individuals who lacked adequate protection from experimental procedures. Morrison's impossible hand, accidentally preserved in what was intended to be a celebration of family prosperity, served as testimony to the human cost of unregulated medical experimentation. Modern medical ethicists worked with Dr. Blackwood to develop educational materials explaining how contemporary informed consent procedures and institutional review boards had evolved partly in response to historical cases like Morrison's experimental surgery. Genealogical researchers helped Dr. Blackwood contact descendants of the Morrison family and other affected families, many of whom had never known the true circumstances surrounding their ancestors' medical treatments. The revelation of the experimental procedures helped explain family medical histories and provided context for understanding their ancestors' experiences. The research findings were shared with medical schools, bioethics organizations, and patient advocacy groups as examples of how medical institutions had historically prioritized research interests over patient welfare. William Morrison's story became part of efforts to strengthen patient protection and ensure that experimental medical procedures are conducted with appropriate ethical oversight. The photograph stands today as a reminder that, behind carefully constructed presentations of medical success, often lay hidden suffering and exploitation that was systematically concealed from public awareness. The accidental documentation of Morrison's transplanted hand continues to serve as evidence that historical justice requires acknowledging the experiences of patients who were harmed by unethical medical experimentation, ensuring that their sacrifices contribute to improved medical ethics and patient protection for future generations.